moving on to the reason we're here, which is broadband, I think I'm not going to talk a lot about why the goal of ubiquitous broadband is desirable, because I think that'd be pretty much preaching to the choir. So I will simply say that obviously it is. The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act is investing $7.2 billion in that. NTIA and RUS at the moment are in the process of figuring out how that money can be best spent, and the FCC is devoting enormous talent and resources to producing the national broadband plan that has been referred to. I think what is important as we look at the two aspects, the demand side and the supply side, is first and foremost to keep in mind those two sides are iterative. Demand spurs supply, supply spurs demand. And so both of those have to be addressed. And also to keep in mind that the government has very limited control over investment. So assuming, as I do, that the other priorities that the government has for taxpayer dollars and the deficit mean that that $7.2 billion is pretty much all of the direct government investment that we're going to see in this area, the obvious implication is that the rest of the money has to continue to come, as it has up to now, from the private sector. And that means that investors are going to have to be comfortable that they will be able to recover their investment with the appropriate risk-adjusted compensation. And while that sounds very obvious, and you may be sitting there wondering why I'm belaboring the point, I'm belaboring it because it doesn't seem to be quite so obvious to many of the people who are making proposals about how broadband ought to be regulated. And in fact, even referring back to some of the things Tim was talking about, it's not necessarily obviously the way the technologies in the industry are evolving. Some of the proposals, a lot of the proposals, deal directly or indirectly with how companies that invest in broadband would be compensated. In other words, they talk about pricing. They talk about it from all sorts of angles. Some people are convinced that all pricing ought to be at the end user level, that broadband networks should and perhaps only can be paid for by end users, which might be fine, except you also have other people who are in there saying, and of course those prices need to be very low in order to stimulate demand. That combination of ingredients makes investors very nervous. You have a lot of different viewpoints on the topic of competition. I mean, it's sort of generally seen as a good thing, but when you think about broadband networks, wired as well as wireless, as being essentially huge pools of fixed cost, that is not conducive to large numbers of competitors providing services at very low prices. So there are some trade-offs that either the market will evolve naturally or that regulators are going to have to think about between levels of competition and the ability to recover cost, between the ability to recover cost only from end users or being able to recover cost from people who are carrying services over networks, which was the way the voice world worked. That's what inter-carrier compensation was. So there is, I think, the most fundamental issues that are going to have to be dealt with is what does the business plan for the broadband network in the IP world look like? Does it evolve into a scenario in which everything is viewed as marginal cost approaching zero, in which case, where is payment coming from? Or is it viewed as essentially an essential service that is paid for at various levels? Are broadband providers also allowed to recover costs by carrying content and providing other services, or do you not want that sort of vertical integration because it might potentially have anti-competitive implications? I think Congress, to a certain extent, is struggling with that. Certainly, the FCC's going to be struggling with that, and the industry over the next few years is going to be struggling with that. On the demand side, I think what is most important to recognize is that the market, and again, this is something that seems very obvious, the market is highly segmented, and approaches that might help incent demand from some groups are not going to work with others. So when you're talking about providing cheap laptops, for example, in order to make access available, that may work. Cheap and very simple and easy to use laptops may be appropriate for one demographic group, may be totally unappealing for another. They may be appealing to seniors, but they may be totally unappealing to youngsters who really want the kind of capacity that gaming, for example, or video requires. So those are, I think, some of the issues that need to be dealt with. Beyond that, I think there's just a question of sort of regulation itself. Clearly, there has to be healthy balance. The industry can't be totally unregulated, but I think it's fairly important to make sure that it's not going to be regulated simply for the sake of regulation, particularly in an area that's been referred to before, the net neutrality area. I think it is very important to balance the need for an open internet with the ability to manage networks, not only for the sake of the network operators, but for the sake of those segments of consumers who don't find everything on the internet particularly appealing and who want to be protected from malware or from spam or from obscenity, or at the government level, obviously, there are all the cybersecurity issues. So again, all of these issues need to be dealt with in a balanced way. Also, in terms of dealing with regulation, there are huge numbers of regulations that are not directly aimed at the telecom ICT world, but are going to impact the way broadband can be used. To give you one simple-minded example, we all, I think most of us, think telemedicine would be a wonderful thing. But there are barriers such as, for example, state licensing laws. It's a nice idea for a child in Florida to be diagnosed by an expert at the Mayo Clinic, except perhaps the expert at the Mayo Clinic is practicing medicine without a license in Florida. So how do you remove that barrier? How do you remove barriers, for example, such as insurance or Medicare or Medicaid compensation for telemedicine? So there is a huge, huge array of issues like that that really need to be looked at across the administration to clear out a whole thicket of barriers that would affect broadband deployment and, more importantly, the ability to use broadband. So, in summary, I think there are really a couple of points that I would like to leave with you, obvious as they may be. One of which is, whatever the broadband plan is, it needs to respect the underlying economics of the industry. It needs to respect the technology as it's evolving. And it needs to respect the fact that investment will, for the most part, have to come from the private sector, that the biggest piece of investment in the whole ICT world is in the fixed broadband networks, and that the concept of investing in the broadband networks has to appeal to the individual investors who are sitting behind the companies and making the funds available.